something a little unusual. I'm going to make a second pass through the material that is on, let me see, recording 3 and 4 in this series. The content's good. There were technical flaws in the recordings. If you don't find them too distracting, they're not bad. Just let it go. If you do, then this recording hopefully will be free of the the crackles and those kinds of things in the audio. But I will put a different spin on it. And what I want to do in this pass through the material is emphasize a little bit more Durkheim's concerns at the moment when he wrote Elementary Forms in Religious Life. And in particular, I'd like to talk before we're done about the 1915 essay, also I think translated by Swain, Germany Above All, the German Mental Attitude in the War. And I think what you'll do is you'll be able to see immediately a political and contemporary application of the ideas that we're talking about in this section in this article. Okay, so where I began last time, or in the other series, is this image that I had sketched out in a faculty meeting and then cleaned up later, and it's an image that attempts to depict the essence of Durkheim's arguments in one go. So what you have here is an assemblage of people, real bodies, real musculature, real minds, real psychic attitudes, real sentiments, right, that are actually being brought together and compressed in a dense assembly. And so this is a moment of the sacred, when the clan or the church or the political movement or whatever group it is together as a real presence. And then the what I have here is a religious icon, or you could put a totem in here, a witchetty grub or a grass snake or a carpet snake, whatever you want to put in here would work. But instead of the image, I have a mirror, right? So the idea depicted in this picture is that Durkheim argues that societies, the real presence of an assembled group of human beings, requires an imaginary support in the form of a totem or a spirit or a god or an icon, in order to sort of be able to clarify, to externalize, to be able to cope with the emergent real forces that the assemblage generates. Okay? In other words, societies generate real power and force, and they require a mirror in order to see themselves and see the location of that support. So as I always say, mirrors are weird things. Mirrors give the visual impression of being located somewhere else. So even when you look in a mirror and you see yourself, you actually visually, are tricked into seeing yourself in another location, and you're transformed in certain ways. Polarities are reversed and that kind of thing. And that's what Durkheim argues, that an icon, a totem, a religious figure, an idol, a god, is the resultant of, or is a necessary imaginary support for society to sort of see itself, feel itself, and manage itself. So to quote my friend Mark Worrell, when an individual looks into a mirror, they see a self, and when a society looks in a mirror, it sees a god. And this is sort of Durkheim's argument, that you need this imaginary support in order for the group to be able to make sense of its own real force, and to be able to generate it, condense it, generate a surplus of it, and to be able to use it in a socially meaningful way. Okay, so that's where this is going. So like I said in the other recording, if Marx is our primary theorist of value, of economic value, Durkheim is our prime theorist of values, of social values, in the form of totems and rites and rituals and subsidiary taboos and other things. He really tells us what the source of these things is, which is the actual assemblage of the group, and he tells us how they function and why they've been necessary over time. And that's what chapter 7 actually does. Okay, so chapter 7 is about the origin of the totemic principle, or mana. So in the previous recording, we talked about the Dakota notion of Wakan, or the Polynesian / Melanesian notion of mana. So these are folk concepts among early tribal people, where they had a name for the real presence of the force of the sacred in their life. It was impersonal, it was indistinct, it hadn't yet been sort of imagined in the form of a god or a totem or an icon or something, right? Instead, it was just a kind of impersonal force. That's mana. Okay, and so in this chapter, Durkheim is going to tell us where the origin of mana is. Okay, and he's going to tell us, of course, that it's a real thing, but that it is actually a force generated by the actual bodies of the assembled group rather than the god. So again, my sort of mantra for this section is that this book, and really all good classical sociology, tells us that content is actually unimportant, or relatively unimportant. That it's structure that determines social life, not content. So it isn't the content of the totem, the grub or the rabbit or the kangaroo. That isn't what matters. It isn't the content, or even this sort of the image of the content. It is instead the actual assembled clan that generates the power, and that is the source of the force that is known as mana. So the totem is doubled as both a symbol of the group and a symbol of the god, and so we need to read here on page 236. So on 236, let's see. The totem is before all a symbol, a material expression of something else, but of what? So what is this thing? So here he gives it. In the first place, it is the outward and visible form of what we have called the totemic principle, right? So that's what it is. And so the little chiringa that we were looking at earlier, that's what this is. It's not really a very photographically accurate depiction of the animal, but it is a symbol of it. It's an emblem or a symbol of that animal, okay? So that's what it is. But it is also the symbol or the emblem of the determined society called the clan, okay? So again, the clan itself sees, when it looks into a mirror, it sees the totem. And what Durkheim is going to tell us, this is actually sort of like the brand, or the mark, the identifier of those who are part of the clan, okay? So it's a doubled thing. It is the visible mark of the clan's personality, a mark worn of everything which is a part of the clan under any title whatsoever, men, beasts, or things. So all of the things are part of the clan. It is at once the symbol of the god and of the society, right? So how can it be both? How could it be both if these are two different things? So what he says is the god of the clan, the totemic principle, can therefore be nothing else than the clan itself, personified and represented to the imagination under the visible form of the animal or vegetable, which serves as totem. Okay, so that is it. Okay, that's his argument. That's what the totem is. The totem is the imaginary symbol, or the imaginary support, so that the clan can see itself, identify itself, call itself together, generate rites, generate energy, and so on. Okay, so that's what it is. So in the Lacanian triad of the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary, the symbolic is the world of language and law, right? And that is where this falls, the actual totemic principle, right? The emblem, the name, falls into the category of the symbolic, the language and law structure that provides that structures the relations of those who are assembled in the real, right? The embodied real clan itself. Okay, so the embodied group of people, their minds, their bodies brought together, that is the real um, 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 source, the real presence of mana, the real source of mana comes from this assemblage. That's where social force comes from. It is structured by the symbolic order, and then it is supported in the imaginary by the necessary illusion of and misrecognition of a totem, or a god, or a demon, or a spirit. Okay? So the totem, again, is mostly experienced here in the sort of register of the imagination as something that is visibly, that can be called to mind visibly and so on. But it actually is both a um, um, but the totemic group is actually, again, a symbolic structure of names, norms, language, and law, and a real presence of the physical embodied members of the group that are there. So, page 237, there's an immanent force and power, a moral order, a moral authority that generates respect, that commands respect, and that is what is generated by the real presence of the members of the group. Okay, so page 238, 239, society generates the moral authority of the totem. Society speaks through the members, they're spoken by the society itself, right? The totem gives commands that are not resisted by the group, that kind of thing. So maybe it's actually worth taking a look at that. Yeah, so the commands of the totem are usually short, peremptory, no place for hesitation, um, excludes all ideas of deliberation. It's ascendant over the individuals, right? It has power, constraining power over them. Um, uh, yeah, since they are elaborated in common, these commands or these interdictions or orders, since the totemic beliefs and commands are elaborated in common, the vigor with which they have been thought of by each particular mind is retained in all the other minds, right? And reciprocally. The representations which express them within each of us have an intensity which no purely private states of consciousness could ever attain, for they have the strength of the innumerable individual representations which have served to form each of them. So it is society, I just love this line, it's society who speaks through the mouths of those who affirm them, the totemic ideas, in our presence. It is society whom we hear when we hear them, and the voice of all has an accent which that of one alone could never have. Okay, now I'm Roman Catholic. I mentioned in the other recording. When you're in a Roman Catholic Mass, there are all of these responses that are spoken in unison by the assembled mass, the massed bodies that are there. People have actual vocal cords. Their voice vibrates the bodies of the other people around them, right? And so when you hear this voice of unison responses spoken by, say, 1,000 people who are assembled together in a cathedral, um, you know, the, the individual being spoken from society by society, right? They're not speaking on their own account. They're being spoken by society itself, by the commands of the totem. And what you're hearing isn't the voice of any individual; it's the voice of society, the voice of that assembled group. So the real presence of the other people is what generates this force that we hear as the voice of the totem. So I had images of that I was showing here, right? That that when you're in the presence of the assembled members of the totem, right, the voices that are heard are the voice of the totem, not the voice of individuals. They're often spoken in unison, and so on, right? But they're experienced as again, the voice, the commands of the group itself. Okay, so yeah, so the commands have psychical power because they're collective. Okay, and that again, this is one of the points that Durkheim keeps making, is that sentiments and ideas that are expressed in common have greater force to them, right? That there's a magnification of force that becomes greater than any individual emotion or any individual sentiment could be, right? So social pressure, collective force, moral authority, that when people are assembled, right, that the force that each of them generates becomes clearer and is greater than that of the individuals. So page 240 is a great passage regarding homo duplex. So let's take a look at this. Yeah. So this is one of the great passages of the book, 240, 241. I've written all over it. A God is not merely an authority upon which whom we depend, but a force upon which our strength relies. So the sacred principle somehow gets inside of us and gives us strength, lifts us above ourselves, right? And social action does not confine itself to demanding sacrifices, privations, and efforts, but it's a collective force that gets in us, right? It's not just outside of us, but gets in us and it doesn't act upon us wholly from without. Society can't exist except through individual consciousness. And so people become elevated, magnified, right, when they are subject to this collective force. So again, let's take a look at an image of this. So this is one of my favorite images from the Spencer and Gillen collection. It's an image of an initiation. So here's the neophyte being literally elevated and magnified by the power of the totem. So all of these men, these are the real bodies of the members of the clan, but they're in the mode of the totem that's initiating the new member. So the new member is experiencing each of these people not as the individuals that they are outside of the totemic ritual, but instead is literally experiencing the power of the totem that is elevating it, right? The force. So no individual can jump that high, right? But the group together collectively can elevate, can throw the individual that high. So there's a surplus of power, a surplus energy that the individual feels overwhelming, greater than them, not resistible, right? Any group of people who assembled could kill or crush any individual, right? Because there's an enhancement of force here that you wouldn't otherwise have. Other images of that too. Yeah. So again, like when the totem is assembled, or the clan is assembled in its sacred totem form, again, each of these men is acting in a manner that's stereotyped, unison, shared, simple probably, but those who observe it aren't seeing the individuals; they're seeing the totem itself in action. So it is the assembled bodies and of the members of the clan that generates the real force that's experienced as mana. That's his argument. So he says there are occasions when the strengthening and vivifying action of society is especially apparent in the midst of an assembly animated by a common passion. We become susceptible of acts and sentiments of which we are incapable when reduced to our own forces, and when the assembly is resolved, and when finding ourselves alone once again, we fall back to our original level, right? So we get elevated when in the midst of collective effervescence, right? During the fever, and then we descend back again when we drop out of the totem life. History abounds of examples like this, where we get raised up above ourselves, right? And then he writes about August 4th, 1789, during that great sort of formation of the National Assembly, where there was this great sacrifice and abnegation of feudal privileges of all kinds. And the members of the group that did it had refused to do it the day before, and they were surprised they did it the day after. It was actually the fever pitch of the assembly that caused each person to rise above themselves and to do something in common that they wouldn't have done alone, right? All parties, political, economic, or confessional, are careful to have periodical reunions where their members may revivify their common faith by manifesting it in common. All right, so if you go to the next page, I think like this section in here is one, it's really remarkable. I'm teaching Freud's uh, great book on mass psychology and the analysis of the ego, and here you have uh, Durkheim making an incredibly similar argument, where he claims that an individual, so this explains the particular attitude of a man, sorry about the gendering, but speaking to a crowd, at least if he's succeeded in entering into communion with it. His language has a grandiloquence that would be ridiculous in ordinary circumstances. His gestures show a certain domination. His very thought is impatient of all rules, and certainly falls into all sorts of excesses. It is because he feels within him an abnormal oversupply of force which overflows him and tries to burst out from him. Sometimes he even has the feeling that he is dominated by a moral force which is greater than he, and of which he is only the interpreter, right? So you get that demon of oratorical inspiration that comes from being in the real presence of the assembled group, right? The force is real, right? It's very real. It's something very real, but it isn't a demon. It is instead the actual group that's assembled that's generating that incredible power. The sentiments provoked by his words come back to him enlarged, amplified, strengthening his own sentiment. The passion and energies he arouses re-echo within him, quicken his vital tone. It is no longer a simple individual who speaks, it is a group incarnate and personified, right? So that's what happens to a person who is speaking for an assembly or in front of an assembly, right? You get these big gestures, big words, boldness, and that kind of stuff. And again, you stop being an individual, you are actually the group incarnate that's speaking in a personified way. Okay, so again, so there's periods in history when people come together and look to each other and assemble together more often. Periods of war, periods of attack, those kind of things, when general effervescence, a fever pitch of social force results, which is characteristic of revolutionary and creative epics and so on. The Crusades is mentioned and that kind of thing, right? So this is a common experience in history when people arise at these moments of great transformation and crowds were assembled. So Max Weber's writings on charismatic authority are exactly referenced here. Okay, so 241, the leader agitator before a mass assembly, the demon of oratorical inspiration. Again, that direct comparison to Freud's mass psychology and analysis of the ego, page 241. The real source of mana, all right, the demon that possesses you is the agitated assembled group, the energy that is capable of lifting and elevating the individual far above their own capacity is the group itself. It's imagined as the totem or the god or the demon, but in the end it's coming from the assembled group itself. Okay? All right, so page 242, he writes about demon possession, where people become filled with the spirit, they speak in tongues, etc. And this is all due to the real presence of amassed, bodies and so on. The actual crowd, the fever, right? And people get swept away and swept along in it. So I actually had a few images here that might be worth looking at. If you look at contemporary American various variants of American Protestantism that emphasize people coming together, getting into very tight assemblages, using music, using chanting and other things that usually have a kind of leader who imagines him or herself to be filled with a spirit, with a demon, with a force. And it's usually done in a large assembly, and the assembly becomes loud, and there's all kinds of calling and response that goes on. Well, this is Benny Hinn. And Hinn's amazing. If you've ever seen him, there's all kinds of YouTube videos on him. But he channels that collective effervescence that he helps to whip up in his assembly, and uses it to generate the we'll just call it the appearance of faith healing. Right, so he uses his coat. He's got a kind of an amazing style to him, really, right, where he waves his coat about, and people feel, the pressure of a couple of thousand other people with their eyes upon them, and everybody in the room is sort of believing that Benny Hinn has the power to knock them down and to heal them in some way. And it's astonishing to see people who, at least by all appearances, believe themselves to actually be in the presence of a supernatural, extraordinary force, right? And so again, to Durkheim, you can't do that. Just Benny Hinn alone in a closet isn't going to have that kind of power. It's going to require the presence of the other people. The American Quakers, when they hold their meetings, they actually have this belief, right, that you have to assemble. And it is in the assembly, even getting extraordinary quiet in the assembly, right? But being in the presence of other people enhances the moral atmosphere, right? And people become moved, the inner light becomes more palpable to Quakers when in the immediate presence of other Quakers. It sort of recharges the inner light, right? As we've talked about. And then they feel the presence of the Spirit and can speak in it, right? So it doesn't have to be that kind of loud, raucous, coat waving, demonic, faith healing sort of thing. The quietude of the Quakers has the same sort of structure to it. The monkey chant in I think in Bali is where you see this. It gets re-performed at different events here. Same kind of thing. The people come together. They seem to be animated by a spirit that comes to them from outside, but the energy that is being felt, the pressure that one experiences, is coming from the assembled group itself. Okay, so there we are. Okay, so the real presence then, this is where the source is. The real source is the source of what is felt to be mana, right? The indefinite spiritual power. The real source of it is the group itself. So page 241, he talks about it as general effervescence. A current of energy comes to us from without. There's a perception of real felt forces and agitated crowds and assembled groups. And we seek to imagine the force, right? And so again, like there's this duality of social life. He keeps talking about this, where there's a first phase and a second phase, a first life and a second life. The profane world is the first life of individuated action, everyday activity, and so on. And then there's the second life of sacredness, where you're drawn together, assembled into tight groups. You become much more formal and agitated and so on. And these are the two phases of life, and that both of them are necessary, right? And that each of them kind of helps propel society through important phases of its sort of existence. So page 244 to 5, moral power, moral force, mana requires representation and imagination in order to grasp it, to sustain it. It requires a bearer. So yeah, so you get in here again this idea of the necessary imaginary support, misrecognition, that human beings can't directly or haven't yet been able to directly comprehend the power of mana that comes from the assembled other people. And so societies have required an imaginary support for it. Okay? And yeah, yeah. Okay. So these things are set apart. Yeah. So on page 245, he talks about the cult of reason in the French Revolution. It's sort of a famous painting of this. So this is like in, a couple of years into the revolution, the church was knocked out, traditions were knocked out, the calendar had been reconstructed, so you had a new chronological ordering of time, 10-day weeks, that kind of thing. And so there was an effort made to create a direct sort of religion of society itself. It was first thought of as the cult of reason, as Durkheim writes, and the cult of supreme being, where there were religious rites that were being held. There's sort of a dramatic performance like a religious rite, but where the group of people came together and they were basically worshiping their assembled power. Right? So come together as a group, and instead of honoring and worshiping a god, a demon, a totem, you're instead worshiping the group itself, right? Our own power. So he said it was an experiment. It was short-lived, but it really is so far the only case of a society that tried to get rid of the middleman, get rid of the imaginary support, and have a direct worship of itself. So that was the only time it happened. But beyond that moment, every society everywhere has depended upon the imagination of some external thing, some projected external objective thing that is the source of the mana of the group. Okay? All right. So that duplex structure is again talked about in 246, right? That there are times when the population is broken up into little groups. People go about, they do their everyday work and their job. That's the first life, the first world. And then sometimes the population concentrates, gathers together at determined points from several days to several months. That's the sacred, right? And so it's those two phases, and the sacred is the one that's there. Okay, yeah. And then he describes what happens in those when you get inside of these sacred moments in dense crowds. You feel yourself to, the emotional and passional uh, faculties are imperfectly placed under the control of reason and will. You become transported in enthusiasm. You engage in immoderate movements, crying, shrieking, rolling in the dust, throwing in every direction, biting oneself, brandishing your arms in furious, displays and so on. Again, I'm kind of remembered here. I'm writing a book on variations of American, really global economic theology. The American backcountry South included the holiness movement, or the Holy Ghost people, or at least one variant of it. Appalachian Pentecostals, basically, who used rattlesnakes during their religious services. There are very, very famous recordings of these men and women in these agitated assemblies, usually with guitars, dancing, and all kinds of stuff, where they really literally work themselves up into a frenzy, roll around on the floor, and toss rattlesnakes back and forth. And I believe, again, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this man had actually lost his arm to a rattlesnake bite, if I remember. I know the famous film I like to show in my class includes this image of a man who's bitten. You know, it's the famous biblical passage of this, but the idea is, it seems like it's, you know, the Spirit of God that's causing the agitation. But what Durkheim is telling us is, you don't do this on your own. That agitation, that elevation, going beyond yourself, feeling the Spirit that comes in and causes one to speak in tongues and so on, is something that comes in the real presence of the assembled group, right? And without that assembled group, it doesn't happen, right? So there it is. You feel a sort of electricity, right? It formed by their the collecting together of the people in the group, which quickly transforms them to an extraordinary degree of exaltation. Every sentiment expressed finds a place without resistance in all the minds. Very open to outside impressions, each re-echoes the other, re-echoed by the others, and the initial impulse grows like an avalanche, right? Violent gestures, cries, veritable howls, deafening noises of every sort, which aid in intensifying still more the state of mind which they manifest as collective sentiment then. There's usually music that comes in. It helps to punctuate it and coordinate it. Bull roars, you know, loud noises and stuff come in. But you get this agitation, effervescence, fever, right? It often reaches a point that it causes unheard of actions. The passions are then released. Um, yeah, and people, again, feel that they must set themselves outside of and above their ordinary morals. The sexes unite contrarily to the rules governing them. You know, there's all kinds of sexual transgression that goes on. Exchanging wives, incestuous unions, which in normal times would be severely punished, happen here with impunity. So as Durkheim says, you know, if you're going to violate taboos as strong as an incest taboo, the only group powerful enough to do it is the sacred itself, the assembled group. And so it's only in the midst of these assemblies of incredible effervescence that something like the core rules of the group can be violated. And that generates this incredible outflowing of social force, right? Of power. So yeah, so these things tend to take place at night and at darkness with fires around and so on. They produce such a violent super excitation of the whole physical and mental life that it can't be supported very long. The actor taking the principal part finally falls, you know, to the ground, exhausted. Right? Yeah. So then he goes on to several pages of real descriptions of what this is like, you know, and leaping about, prancing, hitting oneself, hitting other people. You can't even really describe it. He says it's almost indescribable. Um, yeah. So you get lifted above yourself and you don't recognize yourself any longer. You feel yourself dominated and carried away by some sort of an external power, which makes one think and act differently than in normal times. You have the impression of being not himself any longer, right? So you get a dissociated double of yourself that takes over. You become a new being. The decorations that you put on the mask cover your everyday self. You become someone else. You become reborn. You become born again, right, as a member of the sacred, right? So that is literally what an initiation does. It generates a social rebirth, right? And so if the physical birth of the human being occurs at birth, right? The psychological birth of the human being, you know, like in Margaret Mahler's terms, happens, say, at the age of 5 or so, this developmental process. The sociological birth of the human being, the member, when you become sacred, that occurs at the moment of initiation into adult society, right? The sacred society. So again, these two phases, the everyday profane world and the second world, are heterogeneous, mutually incomparable. Everyday life drags along, but boy, it really picks up in these other moments. And right in the midst of these effervescent social environments and out of the effervescence, the religious idea itself is born. So where does mana come from? It comes from these effervescent moments of incredible agitation and action. Okay. Yeah. So again, here's this whole idea of the periodization of life. The first phase of life, work-a-day world, where your energies are dissipated, right? Yes, you're a member of society. Yes, you have a moral flashlight guiding your action, but it's individuated and diffuse. It's not coordinated in any way, and it begins to wind down. And then you're called forth into the second phase of sacred activity, where you're put into a tight assemblage, and there's this incredible generation of social power and social force that reanimates the totemic or sacred principle. Okay? So the two lives then are completely separated from each other, right? And they're incompatible. There's really no clean pathway from one to the other because we are profane and we can't also be sacred. So there's all kinds, again, of these incredibly careful rites of purification and initiation that are necessary to make the move in. All right. So you can't have a private religion. You as an individual can't go from being profane to sacred. Only the assembled group has the power to lift itself up into the sacred itself. Okay? It has to be done. Yeah, so you have the dullness of everyday life followed by the super excitation, the successive phases of a complete lull of everyday life, and then the super excitation in social life that oscillates in a rhythm. And I talk about this in the other video as a kind of social respiration, right? Like a breathing in and out of society itself. Some moments you're out doing everyday activities, and other moments you're drawn together in this other force. All right, so we got that. So again, page 244 and 5, one of the few moments in history when society killed the gods and didn't make a new one was during that brief moment of the cult of reason and the cult of the supreme being in the French Revolution. Quakers, as I said, came close to it, but not quite. Mark Worrell and I have both written about this at different places. So again, 246, the two phase shifting of the sacred and the profane, important. We've already done all this. Yeah, so there are moments then when you get that plateau of incredibly intense collective effervescence and mutual influence and so on. Deleuze and Guattari talk about this as a plateau in the book The Thousand Plateaus, when you leave the everyday and you're existing in a kind of enhanced state of excitation. Again, it can't last forever, and then you recede back into something else. So page 249 then, individuals then are possessed by society, they're overmastered, they're reborn, you get a second self, you become dominated by society, carried away by society, you literally have a dissociated self, okay? You become transformed and so on, and you do things and you engage in activities that you would not otherwise do, right? Okay, so so again, the phase shift 249, 250 to the second life, when extraordinary powers are done. When you you become excited to the point of frenzy. So that's where the religious idea of mana is born. It's the effervescence, that fever is what mana is. Again, no private religion. There's always requires assemblies, assembled groups, and so on. You can't have an individual religious cult. Social life shifts into a second sacred phase to refresh itself, right? That really is important, right? So the source of mana is the group itself. The mana becomes projected onto or into or born on, by, tethered in some way to the sacred object, which then seems to bathe the group itself in the sacred light. Again, the source of the light is the group itself. Let's see if we can get my image of that. Uh, okay. I think I have this right here. Okay. Alright, I found it here. Oh, we'll find it later, right? I've got my image of that. But anyway, so yeah, okay. So yeah, so page 251, Homo duplex, the individual person, the profane person, and the sacred person, the social person. So you must occupy both of these worlds or lives or kingdoms and the social collective is made vivid and real by religious assembly. So you need that imagery to guide this massive, again, transformation of self, the entire mode of relating to other people. You shift into a completely different gear. You can't get there from the everyday directly, and so you need this imaginary a thing in order to transport you there and to guide the the rituals that get us there. Okay. Um, yeah, so there's page 251, a necessary imaginary misrecognition in the social world, right? Um, we cannot explain them to ourselves except by connecting them to some concrete, these forces, right? We can't explain them to ourselves unless we connect them to some concrete object of whose reality we're vividly aware. We need the vivid imaginary support in order to make sense of these things, right? Um, If the thing itself doesn't fulfill this condition, it can't serve as the basis for that. Some sign takes its place. It is so that as we connect the emotions it excites. It is this which is love, the symbol, right? The widgety grub, the demonic image, right? That kind of thing. That's what we love. That's what we fear. That's what we respect. It is to this that we are grateful. It is to this that we sacrifice ourselves, right? So we sacrifice to a sacred thing that's actually a misrecognition of the power of the society itself. The soldier who dies for his flag dies for his country, literally, right? That's what Durkheim says, literally. You're not really dying for the flag, you're dying for the assembled group of people whose energies animate the flag, right? Or make the flag seem to have fetishistic force and power. As a matter of fact, in his consciousness, it's often the flag that has the first place, right? You do die for the flag, but it's because it's a misrecognition of the social power. All right. All right, so there we go. You need this. Yeah, and sometimes you're going to allow oneself, yeah, the soldier will allow himself to be killed to regain the flag if it's taken. He loses sight of the fact that the flag is only a sign or a symbol of, right, like this, right? It's only a sign or a symbol of the society, and that has no value in and of itself, but only brings to mind the reality that it represents, is treated as if it were the reality itself. So here's an example of a true fetishism on the part of an individual soldier, where the thing, the flag, is substituted. It seems to have the sacred power itself, right? Rather than the group of people that the flag represents, right? So dying for the flag, the fetish object, right? The thing that, the imaginary thing, um, is again, to Durkheim, a kind of misrepresentation that's due to projection and externalization of the force of society itself. So again, you don't even realize that the impressions come from the group itself. You don't realize that people come and associate and are generating the power itself, but instead you believe it's coming from above yourself, from this external thing, right? You be raised above yourself. You see a different life from the one you ordinarily leave. You can't quite get there yourself. You can only get there when lifted out of it by the sacred itself, which is the assembled group. Okay, so these, yeah, so page 252 and 253 are the key to the whole book. So religion then is yeah, so try to get this. So the sentiments of the assembled group would quickly dissipate if not stored somewhere. So the totem and the imaginary forms allow the experiences to be sustained and revived, right? So even when the group is not assembled, it still has imaginary power for its members because the power of that group, that energy, has been transferred in a contagion way to the symbols themselves, right? All right. So the effervescence becomes a permanent part of life as a result of that. Okay. So I said page 253 is the skeleton key to the whole book. All right. The forces seem to emanate from the symbols, but in reality, they emanate from the group itself, right? So they have to represent the forces under the form of an animate or inanimate being whose name the clan bears. Okay, so it's a misrecognition. It has to happen. So some religious force is nothing other than the collective and anonymous force of the clan. Okay, religious force, nothing more than the collective force of the clan. that it has to be represented in the mind in the form of a totem. The totemic emblem is like the visible body of the god. It is from it that those kindly and dreadful actions seem to emanate. All right? This is the explanation of why it holds the first place in this series of sacred things. So, again, every society up until now has required some imaginary thing upon which the power of the society itself is projected, and then we can orient ourselves to that thing, that mirror object out there, through rites and rituals and so on. Okay? The clan, like every other sort of society, can live only and through the individual consciousness that compose it. So if religious force is conceived and incorporated in the totemic emblem, it appears to be outside the individual, seems to be endowed with transcendence over them. It, like the clan of which it is the symbol, can be realized only in and through them. In this sense, it is immanent in them, and they necessarily represent it as such, right? That is why men believe that they contain within them a principle comparable to the one residing in the totem, and consequently why they give it a sacred character, right? It makes it because you're experiencing these forces coming from outside, and so this gives you an imagination of it when you get transported. Okay, so animals or vegetables of the totemic species should have the same character to a higher degree if the totemic principle is nothing else than the clan. It is the clan thought of under the material form of the totemic emblem, right? Concrete beings whose name the clan bears, right? So that is what the sacred is. So there's the key to the whole book right there, all right? Okay, so religion then is the imaginary misrecognition of social force necessary to all religious societies. The reality of religion is strongly affirmed here then. So the content of a society seems to be the presence of a god or the presence of a totem. And what Durkheim says, the real structure that generates that imaginary illusion is the collected group itself, society itself. All right. Yeah, let's just leave that behind. So page 261, religious force is mana, right? And but the mana comes from group assemblage. It is alienated from the group, projected out onto something where it's objectified, becomes fixed upon this now sacred object that's been set apart and as sacred. And again, it's the structure of that process, that ritual process, bringing people together, setting something apart, projecting the force of the group onto the thing set apart, and then relating ourselves in reunion and reassemblage and so on to that sacred thing. That structure, that religious structure, right, is what generates the sacred. It's not the sacred thing, it's not the content of that thing, it's the structure of this set of ritual processes that generates it. Okay. Yeah, okay. So page 262 then, there's an imaginary concrete form of the totem that helps to focus the imagination of the group, intensifies it and so on. The totem is a storage battery again, because the moral force of the group is precarious and vanishing. The group can't stay excited together. The plateau goes away. It needs to sustain it in this social double that then becomes a kind of storage battery or carrier for the assembled power. So in between these moments of the sacred, the totem image allows for the individual members to carry the collective idea out into everyday life, right? So the totem idea then is charged in the assembly and then continues to guide life because of that charge. Okay? A storage battery. So page 265, the key, a clan or any society is a reunion, a reassembly of members who identify with that imaginary thing that has been set apart. Right? And you set it apart, and then the rites that you maintain are what allow that to happen. Okay. All right, well, let's jump ahead then to our last set of ideas here. So again, just to look at an image, I'll just use this one. So here's a funereal rite, which we're going to talk about very shortly. So again, the real source um, uh, of the power of a funereal rite comes from the actual human beings who are assembled together for that funeral, right? So people come together, they provide real comfort to each other, a real presence of intense touching, feeling, comforting, crying, howling, these kinds of things, right? It's a real presence of other human beings, and again, it's imagined to come from the sacred itself. But the source of the healing is here. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's move on to the next chapter then. Okay, so the end of the book then deals with ritual attitudes and forms of rites. There are negative rites and positive rites, and then there's a third type of rite called expiatory or piacular rite. So let's deal with these quickly. There's a little bit more than that. But okay, so the first set of rites that he talks about are negative rites. What are negative rites? Negative rites are the rites of separation of the sacred from the profane. So, right, every totem has a taboo. I'll use this one because it's cleaner. So there are two taboos associated with every totem. This is from Freud, right? You don't kill and eat the totem, and you don't touch the totem's goods or goodies, the women of the totem, sex, right? So it's the incest taboo and the commandment that one must not touch or profane the totem. Well, the negative rites then are all about that, about keeping the sacred things sacred and not touched by the profane. Keeping the totem as a separate being, page 337. So taboos, interdictions, negative rites are all about keeping the profane and the sacred separated from each other, right? That those two phases of life and those two categories of things can't touch, right? So the profane world must stay profane and the sacred world is sacred, right? And these things can't be approached and touched without being in the sacred mode of life, and the profane is kept away from it, okay? All right. So taboos are policed automatically, or they can be, but generally the group comes together. And the negative rites include punishment, killing even, and some of the piacular rites and expiatory rites do too, those who commit a sacrilege, right? But they're generally maintained through these negative rites. All right. So there's touch taboos, sight taboos, word taboos, symbolic taboos, purification rituals, pollution rituals that people have to go through, in order to get rid and prepare oneself to be sacred. That's what an initiation is, so there's stuff about that. Page 350, the death of the profane self, again, is so complete at initiation as to constitute a second birth. You get a new dissociated self, and like the purifications are so extreme, right? Burning here, right? Here's the subincision ritual, right, where the genital of the young man, women have a cut in the side, but the men actually have the genital cut lengthways and opened up. You get other cutting that goes on as well, right? Cutting and wounding. Somatizing the power of the group, right? So you know the group is real and you know that the sacred powers are real because you're being wounded. You're feeling the wound along the way. Here's an image of the subincision being reopened up by the men of the totem to make sure it doesn't heal together too quickly. Again, you can get infected and die. There's an image here of someone in the midst of a mourning ritual where they've cut themselves open and they've actually bound the skin so that it can't heal together cleanly. So you want it to be really painful and really a real marker, a real experience of the group. Here's an image of teeth being knocked out of a young woman in the midst of a initiation ceremony. Again, somatizing the experience. So the transformation is complete. And you, as I said in the other recording, you can actually be initiated to death, right? It's that extreme. But what it does is it actually, your body is different as a result of this. You get extreme pain. You can't have the old social relations that you had prior to this, and now you become part of the sacred group, right? So, so this is a very extreme form of initiation. So again, you're often ripped a new wound, a new orifice. There's a kind of a somatization, again, an embodiment of the trauma of experience. So again, like when someone dies, you feel psychologically wounded, traumatized by that death, but the funereal rites bring the sacred group together, and then your private pain, your private feelings become socialized. They become somatized with cuts and bruises and wax on the head and all kinds of things, right? And socialized, right? They become known by all, experienced by all. There's a duty to mourn, right? And so the private experience of psychological trauma becomes externalized, objectified. It becomes something that is being managed by this powerful agent, felt to be the power of the totem, but in actual fact is the power of the group itself, right? So societies take advantage of the power of traumas, right? And then to sort of punctuate life and then big moments of life with, again, doubled up psychological trauma, doubled with embodied trauma at the same time, but in trauma that's social, ritual, right, external, objectified, and so on. All right. All right, so there's a contagiousness of sacredness that leads to the immense proliferation of negative rites. So it isn't just the sacred object, but often half of life becomes something that has to be avoided: time, space, objects, and so on. Yeah, and then the structure of the sacred is actually generated by the rites on page 364. All right. All right, and then that leads up to a discussion of the positive cult. What's the positive cult? That are all of the ways you set the sacred apart. The society sees its own power in the form of this thing that's set apart from us. Now you begin to interact with it in all kinds of ways. You sacrifice to it, you feed it, you take care of it, you make offerings to it, or god traps in the form of oblations, offerings that have the do des structure to it, where you exchange, you give a gift, hoping that the thing that you've given the gift to must give you a gift back, right? So you're trying to get blessings from the sacred and so on. So that's page 387 to 391 describes that. You engage in imitative rites that are often done to try to magically create effects in the world. Like you're trying to make certain that your totem animal reproduces, so you're engaged in all kinds of actions to do that. So he argues that these often become a kind of proto-technology, even a proto-science. What else? Page 402. Yeah. Well, yeah, there's representative and commemorative rights as well. Um, Again, where because you have to keep the sacred image out there very strong, you have to have rites that again bring people together so that they can commemorate some important moment in the group, some important ancestor. I know this is a funeral rite, but you're bringing the group together and enacting rituals of commemoration in part. So that the vividness of the totem remains, because it is just an imaginary construct and it must be kept vivid to keep it shared, real in all minds, and that kind of stuff. The collective force that's refreshed as a result. Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of skip some of this. Yeah. So again, the positive cult recharges the totemic batteries, restores the force that has been run down in everyday life. So that phase shift, again, is like the respiration of society back and forth between the first life and the second life, first life and the second life. And because society winds down, right, the values that hold us together need perpetual or at least periodic reaffirmation. And that's what the reunion of the sacred is. You come together, generate incredible levels of power that then get, again, that recharge this sort of moral battery. Okay? All right. All right. And then the piacular rites at the end deal with managing negative emotions, negative feelings, and because the negative is actually part of the sacred as well, that they need place in the sacred. So he talks about the sacred being sacred pure and sacred impure. It's ambivalent. And so not just gods, but demons are sacred, but they're sacred impure, and they must be, because they're made out of the sacred, made out of society, the negative emotions of society, they need to be projected outward onto something like, again, a demon or a negative force, and then socially controlled and managed as a result by the most powerful thing in the world, known to people, which is the sacred itself. Okay, so so let's just sort of end this then with Durkheim's Concern. So, 1915, the year that Elementary Forms of Religious Life was published, he also published Germany, above all, German Mentality in War. It's an article about Germany and why Germany has a unique mentality. And his argument is that it's an absolute state. It's he analyzes Treitschke's sort of nationalistic, propagandistic writings. An absolute form of the state, nothing becomes above the state. So his basic argument is that even gods are placed underneath, right? If Gustavus Adolphus said, I recognize no one but God and the sword of the conqueror, Treitschke basically argues that in Germany, we don't even recognize that, right? There is nothing above the state. So the state is the ultimate sacredness, okay? So the individual can't be sacred unless it happens through the state. The state, as the ultimate sacred thing, can't be held to anyone else. So, it can't be controlled by anything else. So on page 15, 13 of Durkheim's 1915 essay on Germany, this is a direct contrast and comparison to the Elementary Forms of Religious Life. He argues that in Germany, war connotes a political idealism which leads a man to surpass himself, and peace is the reign of materialism. It is the triumph of personal interest over the spirit of devotion and sacrifice, of the mediocre and sordid over the noble life. It is the indolent renunciation of great aims, great ambitions. So the ideal of perpetual peace is a moral scandal, a veritable curse. Uh, you know, Anybody that wants to exclude heroism from human life is subverting morality itself. So again, in the same way, this is basically Germany. Instead of the sacred collective representation being a totem, it's the German state, and that individuals then in Germany are to view the state as the sacred thing, and the phase shifting that individuals go through between the first world and the second world is through sort of civil society and state, and that actually comes up. And the army, by the way, is the ultimate incarnation of the state. So if you want to see the state in an embodied way, you look at the army. So authoritarian states always love to assemble armies and militaries into these moments of effervescent assembly, and then to show the dictator or the authoritarian leader standing in front of this. You'll recall that Donald Trump has a tendency in this direction because he kept wanting to have a military parade, an authoritarian state-style military parade. And our military wouldn't do it, right? But the military then is the incarnation of state power, right? So in the same way that that the clan is the assemblage that represents the totem, is the real power of the totem. The army is the representation of the state. So so let's sort of get to this. So he gets again down at and so everyday morality gets transcended by the state and by the sacred and by politics and especially by war. So in the same way that there's no direct path from the profane to the sacred, there's no direct path from people in everyday life, even religious life, and people in the state and the military and warfare. So war is the ultimate sacred. Peace and earning money and so on in everyday life, taking care of your material needs, your children and so on, is profane, sacred and profane. So here's your two kingdoms: civil society, again, the world of everyday life, family, production, economic activity, and so on, is the profane world, right? Civil society. And the state, especially warfare, the military state in war, is the sacred. And that these two things are set apart. And clearly, the sacred is, So his writing, so Treitschke's writings about civil society, it's all about private interests. It's all about your personal pleasures. It's a mosaic of individuals and of separate groups pursuing divergent aims. The whole formed of their agglomeration lacks unity. It's an incoherent mass of dissimilar elements and so on. But the state, especially the state in war, the state with a military, the state under military command, has a personality and has form. And it's, you know, you're in a true state in that sense when you have a unitary executive speaking the words "I will," right? So the state then is set apart as the sacred thing. And yeah, so again, the dual structure of social life, page 36. It's made up of coherent and persevering efforts directed to enduring, lofty, and distant ends. And here it is, a strong contrast with the dissipation of private energies occupied in the pursuit of immediate, variable, and often opposed interests. So society, therefore, consists of two kinds of forces set in different directions. It reveals a veritable antinomy. Again, civil society, the profane, the state, especially the state in war, as the in its precise language of everyday elementary forms of religious life. Okay, so again, to Durkheim, this is a real worry, and that again, there's kind of like, you know, this notion of an iron chance and other things. So again, the problem with Germany, he thought at the time, is like all authoritarian states or totalitarian states, is that the state itself becomes sacred, and that warfare becomes this most sacred moment in the state, that civil society becomes profane, and that it elevates that everywhere. So it becomes really a kind of love of war, as it were. So it's a kind of worry again in our time. What would Durkheim think of political movements that really have that define enemies, that are all about organizing against enemies, that are agitating for the expression of will, that want to see a unitary executive without a functioning legislature, and so on. Civil society taking backstage to state power and military power, and so on. These are movements that one would want to look out for, according to Durkheim. And with that, I'll stop, and I hope that you found this useful.